Hey everyone, I'm Jim. I got Kate with me here. Hi, Kate.
Hi.
We have an exciting, awesome, I think, ultimately optimistic interview with the head of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, otherwise known as ASCO, Cliff Hudis.
He's great. We're in the day one of the government shutdown today, and I was looking at the transcript before we got on, and he talked about how important government funding is, yes, to advance cancer research, but also to galvanize scientists and to make them feel like they matter.
I think it's hard to talk about what the government funding's responsible for. There's always a lot of controversy with companies. I remember when I was on the corporate side, NIH wanted to take a lot more credit and money for the advances, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there used to be a lot of articles about, well, why are we, the American people, paying for stuff the NIH really discovered that the, companies took advantage of? So it's actually an interesting kind of concept, but I think what companies are great at is the clinical research, and the basic science is where you get these breakthroughs, and that's what he's saying. What he's saying is the government funding, as far as clinical trials are concerned, not as critical. That's where the companies come in. And then, of course, I'm on the foundation of the National Institutes of Health, and we work on the public-private partnership. I think depending on what vantage point you're at, I think the simple message is that it won't be as bad. He was optimistic that it won't be as bad as we thought, that there's enough bipartisan support to continue to support it. The person that he thought was going to take over took over today. That was announced.
Yeah.
So that was good.
Yeah.
And so he'll be an advocate. And then I sat down with the head of the Cancer Research Institute today, and we're all going to the Cancer Roundtable together. So I guess my view is more optimistic. I think you're going to get more bipartisan support as people are educated about why we need to do this. And someone like Cliff Hudis at the vanguard, with ASCO is critical to that. And he'll be a champion, and he's well equipped to do that because he's easy to talk to. He puts it in terms people understand, organized, and doing a great job with ASCO. And, he's certainly earned his space, right? He's been treating patients from the beginning, very involved, of course, in the development of Herceptin and other terrific drugs. And, a guy who cares about patients, which is what we really want to see more of.
Totally.
So thanks for being with us today. A lot of what we've been doing on the podcast has been talking about patient empowerment and taking control of your own health. So I know that's obviously something ASCO has led the way in over the last few years. So I definitely want to get into that. But before we do that, I remember working with you back in the day on the original startup of Genomic Health, which is now part of Exact Sciences, and of course, the launch of Herceptin when you were at MSK. Since this episode is going to air in October, Breast Cancer Awareness Month, I just thought we'd start with what's been your why in breast cancer and your overall outlook on the disease, how far we've come, how much more we have to do, and what we can learn from the progress there that can help us with some of the other cancers that have been a little more recalcitrant. I know ASCO represents all cancers, but breast cancer is obviously still in our lives, and a lot of interesting things have happened there. And you've been a big architect of the evolution of that.
Thank you. So maybe the right way to think about this is there is my career in breast cancer, and then there is ASCO. And my career informs the other, what I do now. In order to answer your question, I feel like I have to provide a little bit of a review of my own career, because a lot of things happened that were just accidents, happy accidents in a way. I went to medical school very young for an American. The point is that I was out of med school at age 24, did internal medicine, and then struggled towards the end of internal medicine to figure out what I was really interested in. I thought about cardiology because in a way it's very mechanical, makes a lot of sense to me. Inspiration hit me in the oncology clinic because really in the very early part of the 80s, you could write on one piece of paper, two sides, essentially all of the active drugs in cancer. That's how limited the field was. And I wanted to take part in what I thought would be a rapidly expanding field. You have to appreciate, even by the late 70s, we were already talking about so-called guided missile therapy, which was antibodies and payloads and the like. We just didn't have them yet. So I got interested in oncology, A, because of the technology, and then B, because I like, it sounds a little funny, but the seriousness of it. I liked helping patients and families confront this feared moment and hopefully getting across from the fear to a place of optimism. And that's true to this day in oncology for all of us, I think. So then I committed to go to Memorial Sloan Kettering for my fellowship training. And this is the happy accident. I started in July of 1988. And in the fall of 1988, Larry Norton came over from Mount Sinai. And at the time, Memorial for Breast Cancer was a famous surgical program with a little bit of drug development, which is maybe not different than other places, but it wasn't the big program in breast cancer medicine that you came to know. And Larry had obviously remarkable dreams and vision and built out this program pretty quickly. And I was there for this transformative decade in breast cancer. It's sort of hard to believe, but if you go from roughly 1988 to 1998, 1999, just over a decade, I think this is the order, but pretty much paclitaxel came to the clinic, GCSF came to the clinic, BRCA was identified and testing began, HER2 was identified and treatment began, oral aromatase inhibitors appeared, and the first conventional but oral chemotherapy drug, capecitabine, ended the decade. So that was a really exciting decade in breast cancer. And it played out in public health because, of course, the peak incidence of breast cancer death in the United States was about 1990. And it's been a pretty steady and steep decline from there. And that gets me to the question you asked, what can we learn from that? What I always found especially uplifting and exciting about the breast cancer world is it was a community, albeit a big one, a global one, but there was tremendous coordination both within the U.S. cooperative group system and beyond, so that the clinical trials were more often than not were coordinated, aligned, and they built in a series of steps, and they developed or tested principles as much as specifics. And I think that's the takeaway lesson that is relevant for today as well. I think across all of oncology, the collaboration and clarity about what the studies are intended to show and what principles we're trying to prove, I think is the most useful way forward.
What I remember is how you all really did take into consideration seriously the patient point of view with Susan Love and my high school babysitter, Ellen Stovall from NCCS. I felt like they had a seat at your table together. I felt like there's almost no other part of cancer that I've seen, maybe NHL and the folks that do the blood cancer work, that I think was very breakthrough too. But is there something to learn from working closely with patients? Like, I know you said you miss working in the hospital at MSK, working with patients, caregivers, families. I just went through that with my wife, working through that. And if there's anything I can see going forward, looking forward and taking lessons from the gene therapy world, or what I would call the ultra rare disease world, it's often led by people and patients and families. And how critical is that? And I do feel ASCO, again, has opened up in the time you've been there, a much more open dialogue with the patient.
That's interesting. I always think about it in the grand sweep of history. Frankly, I think it begins with HIV. It was Larry Kramer and ACT UP that really, I think, blazed the path for patient activism, family activism, and so forth. And breast cancer followed with the pink ribbon, both Evelyn Lauder and the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, Susan Komen. And I think the role of the advocates, cemented, because there were a lot of times where toxicity was an issue. The value of therapy, I think, could be debated, and being open to the patient voice in a formal way on the research side was just a mirror, I think, of the kind of dialogue that a sensitive physician should be having with an individual patient about their treatment choices.
You don't still see patients, do you?
I actually do, although I hasten to point out, unpaid, I'm not moonlighting. I still see a very small number of my long-term follow-up patients when I'm in New York at Memorial on Friday afternoons, a few times a month. I enjoy that very much. It means a lot to me to see my patients and connect.
Yeah, that's incredible. How has being the CEO of ASCO changed the way you make impact then? It's not direct to patient, but maybe some other way.
First of all, that's a great question, but I actually think it's the inverse of what happened in my career. So I spent the first decade of my career as a pretty conventional drug developer, mentored initially by, again, Larry Norton, had the opportunity to work on a number of, I think, exciting drugs. When I became chief of breast cancer at Memorial, which was 1998, and I began to then shift to the role of mentor and pushed out those projects to others, I had an opportunity with a collaborator to start to study a broader and more, I think, fascinating question of causation, and that was, why is obesity a rising public health problem associated with an increased risk of so many cancers? What's the underlying biology there? And that got us to some interesting findings. But the relevance to your question is this. I came to see that in the end, this was a public health and public policy question. The reason that we have rising rates of obesity in the West has to do with agricultural policy and a number of big issues that are really managed on Capitol Hill as opposed to in a doctor's office. And I then was developing in my career as a volunteer and leader at ASCO, and I found myself eventually on the Government Relations Committee. And I think by that time in my life, I mean, I'm older than people realize, but by that time in my life, approaching 50, I probably had peak cynicism about government. And I'm not commenting on the current environment, but I'll just say at that time, we were coming off an era of almost a decade of flat funding at the NIH. And I found that profoundly upsetting because A, that meant functionally we were cutting investments because of inflation. And I found myself on Capitol Hill supported by ASCO asking representatives and senators and their staff why we had decided to cede scientific leadership to others, why we were cutting our investment, which had been a critical part of the post-World War II leadership of America, in my opinion. And interestingly, that was around the era when we began to see steady year-over-year increases, culminating at the end of the Obama presidency, obviously with Cures Act. And that was bipartisan. So I began to believe strongly that we could make a difference. And that's why I came to ASCO. It was the opportunity to wield a bigger lever in terms of policy, certainly in terms of appropriations and spending. And that's been a big focus all the time that I've been here.
Right. I can't imagine we're not in deja vu, right? Whether you comment on what's going on or not, you still have to help.
Yeah, well, the pressure has to be kept up. But it's a really interesting point. This is going to air in October. I don't know what the next couple of weeks are going to bring in terms of continuing resolution or shutdown. But I will point out optimistically that despite the rhetoric that we've heard and the specific calls for significant cuts at the NIH and the NCI, bipartisan appropriators in the House and in the Senate this summer and fall have called for at least flat funding at the NIH and the NCI. And in this climate, A, that's a victory. B, it's not the story of cuts that we've all been hearing exactly. And C, it's a reminder that there is at least one corner of the legislative world where a rational argument and our unified voice seems to be able to maintain momentum.
Yeah, I'm going to have Elias Zerhouni on to talk about his book related to, disease not knowing any politics. I mean, I guess you sign up for that too. I mean, everyone's going to get hit by the bouncing ball and everybody needs these breakthroughs and advances.
Well, the argument for U.S. federal investment in biomedical research, science writ large, and oncology or cancer specifically is unassailable. It's one of those triple wins because we make quality of life better for Americans. We get a return on our investment, an ROI that's measurable and real, and we maintain American leadership in the technology arena. There's no argument I can come up with against it.
Yeah, I 100% agree. But let me ask the other elephant in the room question, because we see so much advancement in China around their tech. I mean, is ASCO collaborating with Chinese researchers? It seems to make sense to me. And they also have an epidemic in breast cancer in their own country. I can't imagine that we can't help them somewhat and vice versa. What do you think?
Well, that's a much more complicated question.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Number one, they do have growing rates of typical solid tumors and cancers associated with Western lifestyle. And they have, to come back to an earlier point, growing rates of obesity. That's going to be for sure the world's largest market for GLP-1s.
Right.
Right. That's for sure an issue. Number two, I'll just point out that it is technically challenging for American NGOs to formally be involved in China for a number of reasons if we probably can't touch on. But I will point out that there is a large and growing number of submissions, both from an abstracts and manuscripts point of view, but also patent development, intellectual property from China. And although there's been obviously some concerns about the quality of some of that at times, I think fundamentally it's just getting stronger and more, I would say, more worthy as competition with each passing year.
Well, I think both countries have the shared goal. Let's get back to patients, right? Of helping that epidemic that is occurring. And obviously, no matter what your ideology, you want to keep your population healthy to that extent. So look, I know ASCO was at the vanguard and the lead on putting patient at the center of their cancer journey. A few years ago, when you announced one of the meetings was dedicated to that. And sometimes we end with the patient rather than start with the patient. So how has it gone and where will it go? How will ASCO incorporate that?
That's really an interesting perception because I would have argued that the patient was always at the center and never otherwise. But I do think, to your point of view, each year our president focuses on some area that they deem important. We have a presidential theme and we highlight various aspects of care. So I think that probably is what you're referring to. It's a one-way trip. And each time we ratchet up, I think, the quality of something we're doing, we try never to backslide. So where has that gone to? Well, there's now more and more patient and patient advocates embedded in more and more aspects of the academic work across ASCO and the policy work. All of that has to reflect the ultimate, if you will, I hate this word, but I'll just say it here, consumer of the product, which is the patient.
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, having gone through it, what I saw work incredibly well between my wife and Dr. Vanook, who I think you recommended when we were getting going on her treatment, the partnership they got in, the dialogue, I was really impressed by it and how at least her quality of life and her experience with this, whether you could cure small bowel cancer or not, and probably couldn't. We didn't really have all the things one might need, but they worked together to come up with ways to, I think, take her on the journey, keep that optimism higher, and I was really impressed by that. So I think it was a great lesson and something, again, I do feel ASCO encouraged. I've been going to the meetings for 20, 30 years, right? And it has evolved from a more academic focus to a more practical patient focus. I've seen that.
Well, I hope we don't lose, honestly. I think it's important to maintain scientific standards. And of course, we're huge supporters of clinical and translational research. We run clinical trials, but all of that infused by the patient and what's best for the patient. I think that has to always be there, but you can't assume it. You have to do the work to make sure that happens. The one thing that you reminded me of, and I do think this is an important and broadly optimistic issue. When I was younger, when I went into oncology, the most common question that I would get from high school friends not in medicine and healthcare, from relatives, was essentially a kind of a sneer. And why would you pick oncology? That was the question, because they would look at a decades-long career and just with some empathy wonder, like, why would you subject yourself to decades of this kind of emotional challenge? And I think that the story you just briefly described is exactly the answer. because it is empowering and uplifting and paradoxically optimistic to take care of people, do the best you can for them, and guide them through this trip. It always reminded me, among other questions that one has to ask oneself, is this: if nobody stands up to do this, then who's going to be there? It's not like the disease goes away if you don't have people practicing as oncologists. It's still there.
Exactly.
Right.
No, and that's a big role for ASCO, right? You want to continue to encourage that.
But that's the point, is that this is a paradoxically optimistic field, in part because there's so much possibility for progress, and in part because there's so much actual progress that's being made, notwithstanding there's still too many bad outcomes.
Well, I mean, again, I guess it's half glass full thinking. And, my wife's view and sitting with her friends was cancer was a gift wrapped in barbed wire. And she got involved with the Dempsey Center and went on the board, which again is about holistic cancer care, acupuncture and the shamans and meditation, diet, exercise, the things that I think people feel like you have to give up once you get that diagnosis, but you don't, right? I mean, and that is something I think is true. So listen, we need to scale prevention in cancer. And as of right now, everything seems designed to treat it, right? Tell us a little bit more about what ASCO's done and will be doing to change this. So you're not all just about therapies and treatment, right?
Well, that's an interesting question. We're all ideally about never having to treat cancer. However, we will always have cancer as long as we have double-stranded DNA, multicellular organisms, and long lifespans. Right. And this is a touchy topic, I think, for many people. On the one hand, there are modifiable risk factors for cancer, and we are passionate about intervening there. Should people smoke? No, obviously. Obesity is the most prevalent now modifiable risk factor for cancer, although the rate at which it causes cancer does not approximate what combustible tobacco does, obviously.
Right. It's not as direct, take the GLP-1s and we'll reduce our cancer risk, right? Or is that possible now?
It'll reduce your risk, but the point is, I would always make this point. If you saw a 55-year-old, 3-pack-a-day cigarette smoker who developed non-small cell lung cancer, you could be pretty confident about why that happened to them. On the other hand, if you see a 55-year-old obese person who happens to have a colon cancer, you can't have confidence that their colon cancer is from that, because there's a lot of colon cancer anyway. The relative risk isn't quite as big. And by the way, this is an important issue from a patient point of view, because all of this sense of control, it ends up possibly being a pretty heavy burden for patients who can then feel or be made to feel responsible. And so What I'm really saying here is vaccinate HPV, hepatitis B, you will prevent a large number of cancers. Avoid combustible tobacco. Alcohol is the other one, although it's a steady linear relationship. And we as a society have certainly not made any decision that we're willing to forego the other perceived or not real benefits of alcohol in exchange for risk reduction. But to come back to your question, as experts in cancer, our members are often called upon to both opine on this and help make and formulate policy. But it's also worth pointing out, by and large, our members are seeing people after the diagnosis. That's where their professional livelihoods are. Surgeons operate when they have cancer. The radiation oncologist treats the cancer they see. The medical oncologist gives drugs. And so we're basically, or collectively, in a place where we would be happy if there was less demand for our services.
No doubt. But doesn't it make the job easier if you've been diagnosed earlier, right?
So let's just focus on that for a second. So there, the interesting thing is, first of all, for the most common solid tumors in the West, the single most important risk factor is age. So as you have a higher quality of life, fewer competing causes of mortality, greater longevity, you will see more prostate cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, and so on. That doesn't have anything to do with the fact that there's always going to be young people or old people that smoke and drink and don't get cancer. We're just talking averages, right? But it makes the point that I started with, which is that cancer is kind of part of the human condition, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. And so the question in terms of prevention is different than the question in terms of screening. The prevention side is, can we forestall, delay, avoid some of those cancers? On the screening side, you're absolutely right, of course, but there are challenges. We have right now a limited number of cancers where we have evidence-based screening programs, and we need more. We're all optimistic that the molecular revolution that we're living through right now is going to soon yield that. We're not quite over the finish line.
Well, so let's stay there. If AI and personalized medicine are improving diagnosis and risk prediction, why are doctors still relying on traditional tests like mammography and CAT scanning when there are new, less invasive tools to use? I mean, there are. And are we not quite ready for those? I mean, I look at things like Pronuvo, and we can go on. And then there's the Grail and Garden tests and blood tests. And I think there's a range of reliability here. So we know that.
I think you're actually diving into an extraordinarily nuanced and complicated area of science. When it comes to public health and screening tests for cancer, the gold standard may not be what people think it is. Historically, the gold standard was, do you make the population healthier? Because the idea is that you're doing these tests as screens, not diagnostics, in people who have no symptoms, no complaints, no suspicion. And so when you do that, there is for sure some risk of downside harm. You will find false positives. You will subject people to interventions. You will cause some damage. And in order to justify them, you have to ultimately show, as we have with colonoscopy, mammography, lung cancer screening, cervix cancer screening, and prostate, that you improve quality of life or mortality. What you said is we have these newer tests, and some people wouldn't accept that statement just yet. What they would say is that we have promising new technologies that have not yet met the rigorous standards that establish the older imaging modalities. It's a question about what's adequate evidence, and, can you substitute them because they perform just as well and you don't need to do a big population-based study? There's lots of ways that I think we can get over that hurdle. And what I was saying just a moment ago is we're really close right now, and I'm bullish on this personally, but we're just not quite there yet.
Yeah, no, that's great to hear, because I do think new technologies coupled with genomic information we can now harvest, do you think with that we're going to see more warp speed like development in cancer treatments, or is that too much to hope for that fast?
I actually think that we could, but that would require, the warp speed part of it would require a whole of government coordinated effort.
So fine. So taking all the politics out of it, how are you feeling about where we are on where institutionalized research is going and the fate of the overall war on cancer, given new policies and rhetoric in Washington right now, which, to your point, I think what we hear isn't really always what is happening and how even people really believe and feel. So can we believe everything we read about it?
I've heard some, I think, well-respected cancer center directors and others responding to anxieties from staff and others point out that in this environment right now, we can't be reacting to each and every utterance. Instead, we have to wait for the facts to play out. And I think as we do that, we can be obviously much more effective in our response and not waste time and effort on things that might not turn out to be the way we think. So, for example, we, I think, are likely to have a new NCI director by the time you air this podcast. Certainly, there are rumors out there. We'll see. It's been a while. I think that will be really important for our community.
Right.
I think that the fact, again, that at least barring a government shutdown and whatever else is going to play out between now and when this airs, the fact that there are proposals for at least flat funding, it's less than we need, because with inflation and the increased opportunities of broadening science, we should be investing more in our flat funding. But in this environment, if we can maintain flat funding before growing again, that would have to be taken as a minor victory right now. Where I think there's a little bit of a challenge is a question of prioritization of the spend. Where is it actually going to go?
Well, I'm curious because we looked into this for my wife, and I've had Leonard Lee, who's doing a lot of the work in the UK on their cancer vaccine program. I was curious, are the policy decisions slowing research for vaccines in clinical trials, or will we see that? And is it the right word? I always ask the question, is vaccine the right word to talk about these immunotherapies that could be breakthrough?
Well, I think vaccine is one technology under the broad array of immunotherapies.
Right.
And it is confusing, I think, especially for people that may not be in the field, because as I suggested some moments ago, we have two really important vaccines for cancer right now, hepatitis B and HPV. But they are not cancer vaccines per se. They are conventional antiviral vaccines, but the viruses that they protect you against are the cause of these malignancies. So it can get pretty confusing, I think, for people not in the field. When people talk about cancer vaccines, they're typically talking about taking advantage of some distinct epitope on a cancer cell, some target that distinguishes that cancer from the native normal tissue around it, and utilizing the immune system that way. And the reason, I'm oversimplifying, but one of the reasons that this has been such a long and challenging journey is that, of course, the DNA in our cancer is obviously, in most cases, some version of the DNA we were born with. It's not like a real foreign invader in terms of easily distinguishable targets, and you can have a good bit of overlap. I mean, by the way, just as a simple analogy to think about, you referenced trastuzumab at the beginning of our discussion. HER2 is present on many cells of the body. What distinguished HER2 positive breast cancer wasn't the absence or presence of the receptor, it was the amount of the receptor. Related to that, some toxicities of the drug were because the receptor is present on normal, healthy tissues. This has been the reason that I think vaccine as treatment for cancer has been so challenging. And of course, in our era, the development of the checkpoint inhibitors as an initial first step highlighted the fact that by manipulating the immune system, we could make real progress. So I think this remains tremendous enthusiasm for vaccines and for immunotherapies more broadly, and maybe ever more personalized and customized, if you will, immunotherapies like TCARs and so on. But to come full circle, I know I've said a lot, this is really an expensive proposition here. And this is going to take coordinated, steady, reliable year-over-year investments, not just by the federal government, but also by the private sector, and commitment by the academic community. It's a three-part effort.
Well, I mean, so you said we're less funded than we need to be in
That's
this
always
space.
true.
Well, that's true. What's the negative impact it's having? So people just understand why we have to fight for it.
Yeah. So first of all, we always have to fight for it. If you think about my own career, I came here because we were fighting for it. The second thing is I do think it's having a negative impact, and I'll divide it into two obvious places. Number one, there are institutions and specific research efforts that either because of what they study or as an unfortunate innocent bystander effect have been compromised. Those investigators are hurting. Number two, there are investigators who have not yet felt a direct impact, but are living in a state of anxiety and fear about what lies ahead. And I think this is a pretty big thing. I was thinking about your podcast and the audience. People that commit years and decades of their lives to research need, if nothing else, to know that society has their back. And this moment of rhetoric and turmoil, I think, raises questions about society's commitment. And people will not be able, therefore, to stick it out in academia, in their research projects, if they don't feel like year after year they're going to get the support they need.
Or does that have to happen state by state? I guess that's always the argument, right? Federal government is handing over more to if you really look at what's happening, and it sounds like they're not as negative about this space as maybe things appear to be written. There was that New York Times article about the war on cancer.
Right. And that institution is suffering. That's right. There is something to recognize. The largest single funder of biomedical research on earth is the federal government. States are not going to make that up. Philanthropies can't make that up. There are more zeros in what the federal government has in its budget than any entity has. And honestly, it's a collective expression of both our optimism and our desire to build a better society.
Right. And I guess having a new NCI director can only help.
I'm very optimistic about that, yes.
Right. Good. I'm glad to hear that. I wouldn't want to leave. I know there is anxiety because I know people in those labs, and I work with so many of the third-party groups working toward this to fill a void of really education. Do you think it's also a matter of, do you think everybody understands the consequences and even some of these complexities? This ain't easy stuff.
Well, there's some interesting trade-offs, because if you survey the American public across the generations, there is huge support for biomedical research. In fact, it's one of the most bipartisan, unifying, consistent findings. Support for federal investment in research, cancer research, but also all of medicine is ballparking 80, 90+%. There are very few issues that garner this level of support. The challenge, if I may, is it's not clear how many people make their ballot box decisions based upon this. So that's the issue. So the education, I feel like we've done a pretty decent job. People really do want, if you ask them yes or no, they want federal investment in cancer research.
Yeah, no, it seems like a no-brainer, and there's lots of other research that gets done, but cancer research can be informative for many diseases, right?
Of course.
I mean, because I feel like there's that link between the immunotherapy, immunological diseases and cancer and allergy, right? I'm involved with the food allergy group, and
yep.
There seems to be a through line in and around.
Well, some of the science ends up translating, or you learn things from one area and apply to another. That's right. And
right.
It's a simple example, but, we alluded to this before. The widespread use of GLP-1 inhibitors to reduce the acute challenges of obesity for sure will reduce the risk of certain solid tumors too.
Well, that's incredible. So it's certainly been concerning because the numbers seem to be, in some reports, going down. You mentioned breast cancer.
Mortality down, to be precise.
But now we're hearing more about the rising incidence and prevalence of cancer, and especially in younger people, which I think I would qualify my wife in her 50s as being younger, but it's much younger than that. It's 20s, 30s, 40s. Is this happening because diagnosis got better or something else is going on?
I don't have a simple answer. I think it's multifactorial. And what I mean is, I think for the diseases, and it's not all of them, where these increases are being observed, I think that's real. It's hard to believe that it would just be awareness, because in the case of colon cancer, for example, or breast cancer, if we weren't aware, you would still find those cancers just a little bit later and more advanced. So the fact that we're finding more cancers at specific age groups in a few of these cases does suggest that there's something going on. People are speculating about the rising body mass index or specific components of the diet or whatever else. And the truth is, we could speculate about a lot, but we really don't have any good evidence that we can point to answer.
Right. I mean, people talk about plastics and all the other things.
I'll give you just a counterpoint that people need to keep in mind, which is, if you think about the long sweep of human history, when was infant mortality lower? And when was overall lifespan longer than right now?
Not.
Right.
Exactly. Which brings, like you said, the longer we live, the more chance we're going to develop these things.
But to be fair, that doesn't get at the rising incidence of some cancers in young people. So I think we have to look at that really carefully.
Okay. So what I say, though, is to my audience, listen to this, because you too can get hit by this bouncing ball sooner, which is why you have to fight and maybe vote for this part of the equation. We need more, right? And that's what you and I are working toward, the CEO Roundtable for Cancer. What do you think the most urgent needs and priorities to make this more chronic disease and reduce diagnosis and death? Do you think translational research is more important than the clinical research phase that you all focus on? I mean, where do you think the money needs to go most urgently?
That's a version of which of your kids is your favorite one.
Right, you got it. Both can be true. I always use that one too. So you can give me two answers that are true. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just think it's a continuum. If you think about it, we will have dry periods where people invest a ton of time and effort into basic research, discovery science, try to get to translation, and fail, and then something happens. In some ways, the whole story of the mRNA vaccines for COVID are that. There were decades of research before, and in fact, a lot of it looking for a cancer application, so that when we pivoted to try to make the original COVID vaccines with mRNA, the technology was all there and developed. It had been targeted for something else. It didn't work so well yet in the other area, and that was a long effort, but look at the payoff we got short term with Operation Warp Speed. So I think it's all important is the answer to that I have to give.
What worries you about the future of cancer, whether it's mutations or resistance or rising rates? In contrast, what makes you hopeful right now?
Well, I'll answer the second part first. What makes me hopeful is that we've just never had the array of tools and the depth of understanding we have today. And some decades in the future, we will look back at this and think it was remarkably crude. So I am very optimistic about our ability to suss all this out. It's worth interjecting here. There wasn't even a specialty called medical oncology until 1972 to 4.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
This is a new area of human endeavor. There were cancer docs, but there was not a board in medical oncology until, in fact, my predecessors at ASCO went to the ABIM and petitioned for the creation of a subspecialty of internal medicine. But the idea that it came in the early part of my life, the creation of this specialty, is just a reminder of how young we are in this effort and how much ground we've covered already with our relatively crude tools. What worries me is that we will not make an adequate investment to take full advantage of the burgeoning opportunities. And I want to point something out here we haven't touched on. We almost got to it. With our increased understanding of the biology of many common cancers, we are slowly converting them into collections of rare diseases. And by definition, that's going to take even more resources, both in terms of the quality of diagnostics, the precision of treatment recommendations, and the development of the right drugs for those relatively small subsets of patients. When I trained, non-small cell lung cancer was essentially one disease, of course, and now it's a number. And this idea of rare diseases for everybody, I think it's a challenge that we're going to confront more and more.
Thank you for bringing it up, because I absolutely see it, experience it, understand it, particularly with my wife's very rare cancer and that situation and where the money needs to go and the investment. So that further complicates what we're talking about. But look, the next and last couple of questions are all about you and getting a little more personal. So 2 questions I ask every guest.
Okay.
You're going to a desert island and this is it. What's the album you're going to bring along with you if you only had one you could bring?
Oh, it's easy for me. It's the single best rock and roll album ever made, which is Exile on Main Street by the Rolling Stones.
Awesome. Yeah.
If you're, a music fan and you actually take the time to listen carefully to Exile on Main Street, the pulling in of the Delta blues, the melding with English pop in a hidden way, and the way they recorded that in the south of France during a really challenging time in their existence, the music is remarkable for a rock and roll album. It just, it's ageless in its way because its roots are actually going back to the 19th century.
I love how definitive you were. You didn't even blink.
So I've little anecdotes for you. One time I went into an Italian restaurant on East 62nd Street in New York City on Saturday night at 6:00. My wife insisted that we go drop some paperwork off in her office on Saturday night because she's compulsive. So we go there, we walk in the restaurant, and there are a few people at the bar because it's a summer Saturday night. And it's a narrow New York restaurant. We live right near there. And they want to seat us in the front where all these other people are. And I see the back is quiet. And I ask, can't we sit in the back? They look at us for a couple of moments. And then they say, okay. And as we walk to the back, there are 3 guys in suits with earpieces and one couple on a banquette on the left. And they seat us on the right. It's a narrow, like a row house in New York City, right? And I don't take much notice. And then as I'm sitting there with my back to the room, my wife's on the banquette, I hear the distinctive sound of Mick Jagger. And he was sitting there with his girlfriend, the ballerina, 6 o'clock on Saturday night in New York City having dinner. And they were trying to decide when we walked in if we could be trusted to sit back there and not bother them.
For some of us, getting away and having real time off is important. What would be your dream vacation?
I take my dream vacation every single year. I'm lucky. So, number one, I spend a few weeks on a very nice island in the Caribbean in the middle of winter with my wife, and we rent the same house and we did the same things. And it's like, I can't remember one year to the next, but it's a complete disconnect. And we get to live a little like we're in another country for a few weeks.
Yeah, good. All right. So you're really chilling out.
I'm exercising, of course.
Right.
And I'm reading. And I'm spending time with whichever part of my family I can convince to come with me when mom and dad are paying.
Exactly. That sounds quite dreamy to me. So
it's actually wonderful. And the other is, in the last few years, my wife and I have had the good fortune to finally, late in life, have a summer house. Well, New Yorkers say a country house. And so I get myself there and I have a mini vacation most weekends.
That's great. Anyway, this was great. Thanks so much for talking to us today again. Look forward to seeing you in a few weeks. And I assume you're going to make that roundtable meeting.
I'm actually on the Hill that day, to tell you the truth. So,
all right. Well, you got important work to do. All right. Well, I'm glad you're out there doing it. Keep doing it. Thanks for all you're doing. And we'll see you soon.
Thanks for inviting me on. It was really a pleasure to talk to you and an honor.
Yeah, same here. And it went so fast, easy, and well. All right, Doc. I'll let you go.
Thank you.
Take care. Hey, everyone. Thanks for joining me on the Get Real podcast. I hope you feel a little healthier hanging out with me. It's going to be a lot of fun passing this along to others. Please subscribe below. Please share. I'm excited not just to talk about healthcare, but a lot of other fun topics. It's about making healthy talk about healthcare. It's not a lecture. This is supposed to be fun, and look forward to spending more time with you in the future.